Today is July 8th, 2024, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I'd like to study and discuss Aesop's fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. The shepherd boy and the wolf. Now, as soon as I say the title of the fable, you may think to yourself, oh, I know that fable. That's the fable of the boy who cried wolf. And you're right, it is the fable of the boy who cried wolf. But I'd like us to study it together and pay attention to the details, because usually when we hear people talk about this fable, they have a certain idea of what it means, and the text that we're going to read, if we look at the details, really don't agree with what people say of this fable. So I'd like us to not assume that we know it, assume that we already understand it, but read it together, look at the details, and understand what Aesop is actually teaching us. And remember, anytime we study Aesop's fables, we're reading the writings of one of history's wisest men. So let's read the fable together. We'll talk about the details of the fable. We'll look at the characters of the fable. We'll talk about the moral lesson taught to us through this fable. And then we'll take some time to think about how it relates to our lives today, so we can actually make good use of this fable. Because remember, the purpose of moral philosophy is to become good men, to become good people. That's why we're studying moral philosophy. So let's read together Aesop's fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. The shepherd boy and the wolf. If you're studying in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Aesop's Fables course, this is lesson 116. 116, okay? The shepherd boy and the wolf. A mischievous lad who was set to mind some sheep used in jest to cry, "The wolf, the wolf." And when the people at work in the neighboring fields came running to the spot, he would laugh at them for their pains. One day, the wolf came in reality, and the boy, this time, called, the wolf, in earnest. But the men, having been so often deceived, disregarded his cries, and the sheep were left at the mercy of the wolf. This is the fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. Now, as I mentioned before, it's common to hear this fable talked about, and people say, this fable teaches us that we have to be careful that we don't lie, because if we lie, people won't believe us. But that's really not what the fable is teaching. There's more detail than that, and it's important for us to look at this detail in order to understand the real moral lesson of this fable and make the best possible use of it. So first, let's think about the characters in this fable. We have a lad. A lad usually refers to an older boy, not a very young boy, but an older boy. And this boy was put in charge of the sheep. He was sent out to keep an eye on the sheep. The other characters in the story are people at work. Make sure you remember that. Not just people in town, but people at work. There was a lad who is said to be mischievous. That means he used to get into trouble and fool around. And there were people at work. And then we've got the sheep and the wolf. So these are the characters in the fable. The lad, the people at work, the sheep, and the wolf. So to understand the scene or the context of the fable, we have people working, and we're told that they're working in the fields. So they're working in the fields, and this is not easy work. This is farm labor. These people are working in the fields. And farm work is not fun, because farm work is usually done under a lot of pressure. If the weather changes, the work might not get done. And if the work doesn't get done, the crops can be destroyed. For example, here on our farm this past spring, we planted broccoli and cabbage and kale. We had several garden rows of some of our favorite vegetables. And in God's providence, it started to rain. And it rained and it rained and it rained for days and days and days. And as it rained, we weren't able to work in the garden. And the weeds grew and they grew and they grew. And then the sun came out, but the garden was so muddy that we couldn't work in it. And then it started raining again. And for another few days, it rained again. And then it got sunny again. But the garden was still too wet. And then it started raining again. So by the time the rain was done, it had been several weeks. And we weren't able to take care of those plants that had been planted in the garden, and the weeds just grew and grew and grew. And much of the vegetables in those rows ultimately were lost. And the reason I share this story is because it shows how farm work, garden work is often stressful, because we get windows of opportunity to do work, and we've got to get it done while we can, because the weather can change and we can lose our crops, and we'll look back and regret not having taken advantage of this day or that day when the weather was nice. The weather changed, we lost the opportunity to take care of the crops, and now those crops are lost. So farm work, not only is it physically hard, but sometimes it's done with a lot of stress, because the weather can change and crops can be destroyed. Another example with farming for hay, when farmers collect hay, they have to be very careful, because if the hay, after it's cut, gets rained on, it will be destroyed. And so the farmers have to watch the weather very carefully, because they may get just a day or two when it's sunny and dry, and they have to get the hay cut, and it's got to have time to dry out in the fields. Then they've got to rake it all up into rows and then bale it and then get it into storage before there's any rain. And so that work is often done under a lot of pressure, because the weather could change and rain could come in and a whole harvest of hay could be lost. So farm work is often very stressful, and it's physically difficult. So these people were working in the fields, and we can imagine they're working and trying to get everything done with this stress of farming, because they never know when the weather could change or something could happen. And while they're trying to work and do these things, this boy, notice it says he's mischievous and he's acting in jest. That's important. He's joking around. He's fooling around, playing, trying to entertain himself. And the way that he decides to fool around is by yelling, "There's a wolf, there's a wolf," because he's supposed to be taking care of the sheep that are owned by these people in the community there, in the village. And so he thinks it's funny to yell wolf and to pretend that he's in trouble and have all of these people stop what they're doing, drop all their tools, and run to the field where he is with the sheep, and realize these people are coming because they're coming to help him and to save the sheep. And they find out that this boy is just fooling around. So the people at work are made to leave their work by this boy who's fooling around. So time goes on, and this foolish boy who's silly, which that may be the reason why they sent him with the sheep because they didn't want him out in the field where there was work to do. He has a good time laughing at these people as they're made to leave their work and come up only to find that he's fooling around. He thinks it's funny. He's a prankster. And finally, these working people, they realize that they can't mess around with him anymore. They can't listen to him. They can't pay attention to this foolish boy. And so another day comes, we read, when the wolf came in reality, and the boy, this time, called the wolf in earnest. That means seriously. But the men, having been so often deceived, disregarded his cries. So let's really think about what's going on here. This boy, given a job, doesn't do the job well. He doesn't care about the job, doesn't care about the sheep, doesn't think about what the consequences of his behavior might be. He's just always seeking to entertain himself and fool around. Everything's got to be funny and silly. He's always got to be playing while other people are working. He's not thinking about the other people. He's not thinking about the sheep. He's not thinking about being helpful. He's thinking about entertaining himself so that he can laugh at others' expense. It said he would laugh at them for their pains. So we have this selfish, irresponsible, silly person in this boy. And he's fooling around, and finally one day he ends up in trouble. He ends up in trouble, and in earnest, seriously, he yells for help. And when he yells for help, the people in the field surely hear his voice. But they say, pay no attention to that fool. He's just always messing around, always silly. Just ignore him. And what's important is that when this boy needs help, he has lost the trust of the people around him because of his foolishness, because of his silliness. When he needs help, there's no one available to help. Now, this fable, taught by Aesop, is very similar to the first chapter of the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament of the Bible. In the Old Testament, in Proverbs, we read about wisdom, and wisdom is presented as a woman who calls out to men in the streets. Wisdom is always calling to men. She's calling to men to listen to her, to listen to wisdom, and to act wisely. It says in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22, O children, and this is wisdom speaking, O children, how long will you love childishness? How long will fools covet things which are hurtful to themselves? How long will the unwise hate knowledge? Turn at my warning. In other words, wisdom says, look, I'm warning you. I will utter my spirit to you and show you my words. But because I called and you refused, that is, you didn't listen to wisdom, you preferred childishness, you preferred useless things, you hated knowledge. I called and you refused. I stretched out my hand, and there was none that regarded. Everyone ignored wisdom. Wisdom says, you have despised all my counsel, all my advice, and you have neglected my reprehensions, my warnings. Verse 26 of chapter 1 of Proverbs reads, I also will laugh in your destruction. I will mock when that shall come to you which you feared. When sudden calamity shall fall on you and destruction as a tempest shall be at hand, when tribulation and distress shall come upon you, then shall they call upon me, and I will not hear. So that's the warning of the book of Proverbs in chapter 1 of the book of Proverbs in the Bible. And we can see how similar that passage is to this fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. This mischievous lad loved childishness, didn't like to work, didn't listen to wisdom, but preferred foolish things. And then when his time of calamity came, when that which he feared came, he cried out and he was ignored. And so we can see that there's more to this fable than just, oh, if you lie, people won't listen to you. This really isn't about a boy who lies. There's more detail in the fable. It's a boy who loves silliness, who loves foolishness, who doesn't live wisely, who isn't looking at the responsible, working people in the neighborhood and seeking to help them, seeking to be responsible like them. He's interested in fooling around. What this fable shows us is that that foolish boy who doesn't take life seriously, is always fooling around, doesn't seek to help other people, doesn't practice wisdom, doesn't live wisely, that boy will end up in trouble, and when his trouble comes, there will be no one to help him. It's a warning about the danger of a foolish life, of a silly life. The danger of a silly life is that when things get serious, there will be no one to help. That's the moral lesson of the shepherd boy and the wolf. The wolf is serious. The wolf is looking for sheep. And he may tear the shepherd boy apart as well if that shepherd boy gets in the way. The wolf is serious. He's a predator. He's looking for sheep, for food, for survival. He's serious. The sheep are defenseless. They're serious. If you ever spend time with sheep, you'll know that sheep are always looking around. They're always nervous because they have no way to defend themselves. They're serious. The working people are serious. They know there's no time to fool around. The weather could change at any minute and we could lose our food. So the people in the world, even the animals, there's no silliness. There's no silliness among responsible people. There's no silliness among animals. But in this boy, this foolish boy, is this spirit of jesting, joking around, being silly. And this boy goes on in this silliness until finally his trouble comes. And then he decides all of a sudden to flip the switch and be serious. But no one takes him serious. They've learned to ignore him because he's just silly. He's foolish. Just ignore him. And this is what wisdom warns us of in the book of Proverbs, that if we choose to be foolish, if we choose to ignore wisdom, if we choose to not work as we should and be respectful to others as we should, to do our jobs seriously as we should, to work hard as we should, when trouble comes upon us, we're not going to be saved from that trouble because we need to learn a lesson and we need to suffer because of our foolishness. And often God allows us to suffer. Maybe not even often, maybe always. God allows us, when we act foolish, when we're silly and not seeking wisdom in our lives, when we don't take life seriously, God lets us suffer the consequences. And when something starts to go wrong and all of a sudden we pretend that we're going to run and pray and ask for help, God can certainly help us, but God is concerned with teaching us to live virtuously. And one way that God teaches us to live virtuously very well is by letting us suffer the consequences of our foolish behavior. Many people who are foolish, they even tell themselves that they can just stop and pray at any time or ask for help and everyone will help them. That's one of the reasons why they don't take things seriously. But God is a God of holiness and virtue. He's a God who gives us moral commandments. And when we disobey his moral commandments, when we fool around and don't take responsibility, God allows us to suffer the consequences. And that's the warning of the fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. If you fool around and don't take responsibility for your life, if you don't live virtuously but just play and goof around and try to entertain yourself, you're going to end up in trouble. And when you end up in that trouble, there's not going to be any help. You're going to have to suffer those consequences, and those consequences are going to be painful, and they're going to teach you to stop being silly. That's the purpose of those punishments. They're going to teach you to stop being silly. So one way or another, we need to learn to not be silly. We can learn the easy way by listening to wisdom, by listening to instruction, and choosing to act wisely. Or we can go on in foolishness, end up in trouble, and have to suffer painful consequences for our foolishness. That's the warning of this fable. And wisdom would have us act wisely and live soberly and responsibly while we can to avoid those problems, to prevent those problems, not run on into the problems and then yell for help. That's not how it works. So this is the moral fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. And it teaches us a good lesson about the fables, because one thing many students do when they read the fables and do their assessment work is they oversimplify the fable. They don't pay attention to the details. And they'll just say something general like, we should be good and don't fool around or we won't be happy. We want to be more specific than that. This is not just about lying and not being trusted because you lie. It's about a certain character. A character who's mischievous, silly, a prankster, who's joking around when it's time to work. It's a very specific who the fable is speaking of. A mischievous lad who, though he was given a job, used joking around to yell wolf, and then he would laugh at the workers for the pains, that is, for what trouble they took to leave all their stuff and run to where he was to check on him. He thought that was funny. Those are the details of the description of the boy. He's a silly person, selfish, foolish, immature. And he ends up suffering evil things. And there's no one to help him when he does. So make sure when you study the fables, you pay attention to the details, because as I said, some say this is about lying. There's more to it than that. There's more to this fable than just saying, if you lie, people won't believe what you say. That's really not what this is about. There's more detail. So that's the fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. Now, let's think about how this can apply to our lives. How can this apply to our lives? And remember, when we think about applications, our lives are very different. We live in different circumstances. I'm a 49-year-old father at this point in my life. I own a business. I own a farm. I have a wife and children. My life circumstances are certainly different from yours. You may be 12 years old, 8 years old, 16 years old, have your whole life in front of you, and you may be tempted to be like this boy. I can tell you that I am not tempted to be like this boy because I was like this boy when I was young. In fact, when I was in high school, I was voted class clown by my classmates in a very large public school. I was the class clown. I was the mischievous lad who used to annoy people with joking, annoy my teachers. And I used to laugh at the things that they suffered because of my joking around. And I had to go through many difficult times in my life as I got older because I wasn't prepared. When I got to be an adult, 18, 19 years old, I wasn't prepared to be an adult. And all of a sudden, I found myself in trouble. And I learned through those experiences to get serious about my life and not fool around. And you'll notice that I have a pretty sober, serious attitude most of the time. And it's because I've suffered, I've learned the hard way to be careful about fooling around, because God wants us to be wise and virtuous, and he is not afraid to let us suffer. But you may not have experienced that. Even though you may have experienced it a little bit, you may have gotten in trouble or punished by your parents or something like that, or had something bad happen, but maybe you're not totally convinced. This is your opportunity to think carefully about your life and ask whether you're living like this shepherd boy, or whether you're living like another boy who might have been down there working with the men in the fields, a good boy, a responsible boy, a helpful boy. So you've got a choice at this point in your life to listen to wisdom, who tells you to turn away from childishness, turn away from useless things, and devote yourself to wisdom, devote yourself to living responsibly. And you know there are many temptations. We have many, many things that are intended to entertain us and allow us to be silly. And we've got to learn to be careful not to allow them to draw us away from wisdom. And you can think silly movies, silly books, video games that are played when it's time to work, things we do fooling around. Maybe during your studies, your parents tell you to study and work on this or that, and they prepare and provide lessons for you to work on. And when they're not looking, you fool around. You're like this boy. You're like this boy who's supposed to be watching the sheep, but is fooling around. And you've got a chance to fix that behavior and not be like that boy, but be responsible. And in Proverbs, wisdom says, I'm warning you, I'm warning you, I'm warning you, turn away from that foolish behavior and listen to wisdom. Because if you don't, you're going to have to pay for it. You're not going to get away with any foolish or sinful behavior. You're going to have to pay for it. That doesn't mean that God is going to put you in hell. But God may allow you to suffer things in your life as a consequence to teach you justice, to teach you virtue. And you should learn and try to avoid those lessons because, as I said, God is not afraid to allow us to suffer. And he gives us, by his grace, the opportunity to avoid those bad experiences and to change our behavior. So as a Catholic, we should think about times when we're silly or fool around, or times when we don't do what we're supposed to be doing. And we should fear that we're walking down a path that could lead us into some serious trouble. And by God's grace, we have the opportunity through our studies to hear wisdom warning us and to change our behavior while there's still time. So as I said, if you're a Catholic, this is something worth thinking about and confessing when you go to confession, that you've been mischievous, you've been silly, you've wasted time, you've fooled around. When there was work to do, you just wasted time or did silly nonsense or sought out useless things and so on. We need to be forgiven for these things that we do, and we also need God's grace to be stronger to resist these temptations and do what's right. So this fable and the warning from the book of Proverbs are a grace to us. Because today, as we study these things, we have the opportunity to examine ourselves, catch ourselves in bad behavior, confess that bad behavior, and ask God's forgiveness, and make ourselves worthy of his grace, which is power to actually live like his true children, obedient and faithful. And we need his grace in order to do that. So that's the fable of the shepherd and the boy. The shepherd boy and the wolf. I think the moral lesson now is pretty clear as we look at the details. We've looked at the characters and understand them more clearly. It's a mischievous lad and people at work, not just people in town, but people at work. And we looked at the sheep and the wolf and talked about why they are significant because they're not silly. And we've talked about how to apply this fable, this moral lesson to our lives. And it's very difficult today because there's so much foolishness, so much silliness. We've got to really be careful. So I hope that that's helpful. As I always say, you can read these fables and say, I see something else in here. Look at this. Let's think about this through the eyes of the sheep. Let's think of this through the eyes of the wolf. Let's think of this through the eyes of the people at work. If you meditate on the fables like that, you'll be able to think of other moral lessons, which are very helpful. You can also take time to reflect on your life and think about where in your life you're like this boy and how you can fix that. So there's a lot to think about, lots of different applications because, like I said, all our circumstances are different. But this is the fable of the shepherd boy and the wolf. I hope that's helpful. Reread the fable for yourself. Think about it for yourself. Then, as I said, if you're taking the Aesop's Fable course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, it's lesson 116. Go and complete the assessment. Prove that you've studied the fable carefully and you've thought about it carefully. And we'll move on in our study of Aesop's Fables. God bless.